Every day, roughly one-third of the world's maritime trade passes through a narrow stretch of water between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Malacca is less than 65 kilometers wide. Yet through that passage flows approximately 22% of global maritime trade, roughly 85,000 vessels per year, carrying oil, gas, manufactured goods, semiconductors, and raw materials from producers to consumers across the planet. If the Strait of Malacca closes, global supply chains do not slow down. They stop. The world's busiest shipping lanes, the world's largest economies by purchasing power, the world's fastest growing military budgets, the most advanced semiconductor factories ever built, the greatest concentration of naval power since the Second World War. They all converge in one region, the Indo-Pacific. This documentary explains why. Most people understand roughly where Asia is. Fewer understand what the Indo-Pacific actually is, why governments began using that term instead of Asia-Pacific, what its boundaries are, and why the distinction matters strategically. The term Indo-Pacific gained official currency through a specific sequence of government decisions. Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe used it explicitly in a 2007 address to the Indian Parliament, describing a confluence of the two oceans as a dynamic space connecting the Indian and Pacific regions. The United States Department of Defense changed its Pacific Command to the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command in 2018, a seemingly bureaucratic decision that was, in practice, a strategic statement. Australia, India, and later European governments followed. The terminology shift was not an accident. It was a deliberate geopolitical choice. Asia-Pacific as a concept was centered on the Pacific Rim and the U.S.-centered alliance network that had organized the region since 1945. Indo-Pacific incorporates the Indian Ocean, and with it, India itself, as a co-equal strategic dimension. The shift reflected a judgment that the Indian Ocean, long treated as a secondary theater, had become inseparable from the Pacific in any coherent account of 21st century power. The geographic boundaries of the Indo-Pacific are not fixed by international law. They are defined by strategic logic. The region is generally understood to run from the east coast of Africa across the Indian Ocean, through Southeast Asia, into the Pacific as far as the west coast of the Americas, incorporating the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, and the Pacific Island nations. Within that vast space sit the world's most consequential choke points. The Strait of Malacca between Malaysia and Indonesia, through which China, Japan, South Korea, and much of Asia import their energy. The South China Sea, through which more than $3.4 trillion in trade passes annually. The Taiwan Strait, the 180-kilometer passage between China and Taiwan, through which a significant share of global shipping flows, and on whose shores sit the factories that produce the world's most advanced semiconductors. The Lombok Strait and Sunda Strait, alternative routes through the Indonesian archipelago used by vessels too large for Malacca or those seeking to avoid it. The Philippine Sea, the vast ocean space east of the Philippines where U.S. carrier groups operate and where any conflict over Taiwan would likely be decided. And the East China Sea, contested between China, Japan, and others, home to the disputed Senkaku and Diaoyu Islands. These choke points are not academic geography. They are the physical architecture of the global economy. And they are why the Indo-Pacific is not simply an interesting regional story. It is the story of how the world works, and what happens if that working is disrupted. To understand why the Indo-Pacific has become the world's center of gravity, the numbers are worth stating plainly. The region is home to approximately 65% of the world's population. It generates approximately 60% of global GDP. It accounts for approximately 60% of global maritime trade. 7 of the world's 10 busiest container ports are located in the Indo-Pacific, and the region is growing. Asia-Pacific economies are projected to grow at approximately 4.5% in 2026. Defying the headwinds affecting the broader global economy, according to the MasterCard Economics Institute's 2026 outlook. But the numbers alone do not capture what makes the Indo-Pacific strategically unique. It is not just that the region is large and growing, it is that the specific goods that the global economy cannot function without, energy, semiconductors, critical minerals, manufactured goods, are either produced, transported, or both through this region. Start with energy. Approximately 80% of China's oil imports transit the Strait of Malacca. Japan imports virtually all of its crude oil, and approximately 90% of that arrives through the Indian Ocean and Malacca routes. South Korea is similarly dependent. This creates what Japanese and Chinese strategic planners call the Malacca dilemma. Any power that can disrupt or control the Strait of Malacca holds leverage over the energy supply of every major Asian economy. That single geographic fact has shaped naval strategy, alliance policy, and infrastructure investment decisions across the region for decades. The Lombok Strait, between the Indonesian islands of Bali and Lombok, is the deepest and widest alternative to Malacca. Vessels too large or too deep, drafted for Malacca, including many supertankers, use Lombok. The Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra is shallower and narrower, but significantly shorter. Both straits are within Indonesian territorial waters, making Indonesia a strategically critical state whose neutrality or alignment significantly affects every major power's strategic calculations. The South China Sea is not simply a body of water. UNCTAD estimates that approximately $3.4 trillion in trade transits the South China Sea annually, representing approximately one-third of all global maritime trade. This includes oil tankers from the Middle East to China, Japan, and South Korea, container ships carrying manufactured goods from China to Europe, bulk carriers transporting Australian iron ore to Chinese steel mills, LNG tankers moving Australian and Qatari gas to Asian markets. The Taiwan Strait is the most geopolitically charged of the choke points. At its narrowest, between mainland China and northern Taiwan, it is approximately 130 kilometers wide. This is simultaneously a major shipping route and the most consequential military flashpoint in the world. The strait separates the Chinese mainland from the island that hosts the factories producing approximately 90% of the world's most advanced chips. Any disruption of the Taiwan Strait, commercial, military, or through blockade, would affect not just shipping, it would affect the ability of every technology company in the world to produce its products. The connection to the Strait of Hormuz matters here. The Hormuz Strait between Iran and Oman controls the exit route for approximately 20% of the world's oil supply. Vessels passing through Hormuz, tankers carrying Gulf oil, then transit the Indian Ocean before reaching the Malacca Strait or rounding South Africa. The Indo-Pacific and the Middle East are therefore not separate strategic theaters. They are connected through the Indian Ocean through energy flows that link the Persian Gulf to the energy markets of Asia. To understand the Indo-Pacific's strategic significance, it is necessary to understand the transformation that has occurred in the region's balance of power over the past 4 decades. That transformation is inseparable from China's rise. In 1980, China's GDP was approximately $305 billion. By 2024, it was approximately $18.5 trillion at market exchange rates, and the largest economy in the world by purchasing power parity. China's Navy in 1980 was a coastal defense force designed to operate in China's near seas. By 2026, China operates what defense analysts describe as the largest navy in the world by number of hulls. Its target is approximately 435 ships by 2030, against a U.S. Navy currently below 300. Its submarine force is expanding towards 70 boats by 2027 and 80 by 2035, a program that the U.S. Congressional Research Service has identified as among the most significant naval buildups in modern history. And in 2024, China commissioned the Type 003 Fujian aircraft carrier, its first carrier with electromagnetic catapult launch systems, while a fourth carrier, the Type 004, believed to be nuclear-powered, is in development. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched by Xi Jinping in 2013, is the economic dimension. It is a global infrastructure investment program that has funded ports, railways, roads, power plants, and telecommunications infrastructure across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Within the Indo-Pacific, the Maritime Silk Road component funds port development in Pakistan, Gwadar, in Sri Lanka, Hambantota, in Myanmar, Bangladesh, and throughout Southeast Asia. The strategic logic, as analysts at CSIS and RAND have documented, is to establish port access along the sea lanes that China's energy and trade depend on. It is, in other words, a deliberate strategy to address the Malacca dilemma, to build alternative access points and ensure that Chinese shipping has options if any single choke point is denied. China's anti-access and area denial strategy, known as a 2/AD, is the military complement to the Belt and Road's economic positioning. It is designed to make the waters of China's near seas, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the waters approaching Taiwan, prohibitively costly for an adversary's naval forces to enter. The instruments include land-based ballistic and cruise missiles, submarine forces, surface ships, and the artificial islands China has built in the South China Sea, each equipped with runways, hangars, radar installations, and missile defense systems. America's response has been built on a structure that predates the current rivalry, but has been significantly reinforced by it. The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, INDOPACOM, is the largest of the U.S. military's geographic combatant commands, responsible for a region covering more than half the Earth's surface. It controls approximately 375,000 military personnel, 1,000 aircraft, and 200 ships. Japan hosts approximately 54,000 U.S. troops, the largest U.S. overseas military presence in the world, and is the forward operating base closest to the most likely flashpoints in the East and South China Seas. Japan's 2022 national security strategy broke decades of post-war defense restraint, committing to double defense spending to 2% of GDP by 2027 and acquiring counter-strike capabilities that Japan had not possessed since 1945. Guam is the critical American logistics hub, a U.S. territory approximately 2,700 kilometers from Taiwan, hosting Andersen Air Force Base, Naval Base Guam, and the infrastructure to sustain extended operations in the Western Pacific. The Philippines, through the 1951 U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, has granted the United States access to 9 military bases as of 2023, including facilities in northern Luzon closest to Taiwan and at Palawan facing the South China Sea directly. Australia, through ANZUS and now AUKUS, provides the southern anchor of the U.S. alliance network, hosting U.S. Marines in Darwin, enabling U.S. strategic bomber rotations at RAAF Tyndall, and partnering on the SSN AUKUS submarine program that will place nuclear-powered attack submarines in the Indo-Pacific from the early 2030s. Diego Garcia, the British Indian Ocean Territory, is the central Indian Ocean base enabling U.S. power projection from the Persian Gulf to the Strait of Malacca. Now here is the first island chain, which is the most important geographic concept in Indo-Pacific military strategy that receives the least public explanation. The first island chain is a line of islands running from the Japanese archipelago in the north, through the Ryukyu Islands including Okinawa, through Taiwan, through the Philippine archipelago to Borneo in the south. It represents the inner boundary of the open Pacific Ocean as seen from the Chinese mainland. The strategic logic is this: if China's Navy operates within the first island chain, in the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea, it is operating in what Chinese naval doctrine describes as China's near seas. If it operates beyond the first island chain, into the open Pacific, it has broken through what U.S. and allied strategists regard as the primary geographic constraint on Chinese naval power. Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, is home to Kadena Air Base, the largest U.S. Air Force installation in Asia, hosting approximately 54,000 U.S. troops across Japanese territory. The southern section of the chain is anchored by the Philippines, which is why U.S. access to bases in northern Luzon and at Palawan is strategically significant far beyond the bilateral defense relationship. And at the center of the first island chain sits Taiwan. Taiwan's position in the chain means that a Taiwan aligned with or accessible to the United States, even implicitly, provides the alliance with a central position that constrains Chinese naval movements in both directions. A Taiwan under Beijing's control would break the chain at its most important point, providing Chinese naval forces with unrestricted access to the Western Pacific and fundamentally altering the military geometry of the entire region. Taiwan is a self-governing democratic society of approximately 23 million people, located approximately 180 kilometers off the southeast coast of China. The People's Republic of China claims Taiwan as an integral part of its territory. The government of Taiwan has governed the island since 1949, when Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces withdrew there following defeat in the Chinese Civil War. The PRC has never governed Taiwan. The United States maintains a policy of strategic ambiguity, acknowledging the Chinese position that Taiwan is part of China without endorsing it, and selling Taiwan defensive arms under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. The strategic ambiguity is deliberate. It is designed to deter a Chinese attack by leaving uncertain whether the United States would respond militarily, while simultaneously deterring a formal Taiwanese declaration of independence. But Taiwan's significance is not only political or military, it is technological. TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor and Manufacturing Company, produces approximately 90% of the world's most advanced chips, including those used in the most capable AI systems, the most advanced military hardware, and virtually every high-end consumer electronics device. Significant disruption to TSMC's operations through conflict, blockade, or coercion would have consequences for every economy in the world that depends on advanced computing. That is every economy in the world. Now here is the South China Sea, the body of water that has become the most contested maritime space in the world. The South China Sea is bounded by China to the north, Vietnam to the west, the Philippines to the east, and Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia to the south. China claims most of the South China Sea through what it calls the 9-dash line, a demarcation encompassing approximately 90% of the sea's total area. This claim overlaps with the exclusive economic zones and territorial waters of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled on the legal validity of China's claims. Its verdict was unambiguous. China's historical claim to resources within the 9-dash line had no legal basis under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. China rejected the ruling and has not complied with it. China has continued to build and militarize artificial islands on contested reefs and shoals, including Fiery Cross Reef, Mischief Reef, and Subi Reef. Satellite imagery confirmed by CSIS's Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative shows runway lengths sufficient for fighter aircraft, hardened aircraft shelters, radar installations, surface-to-air missile systems, and anti-ship cruise missile batteries on the larger artificial islands. These installations extend China's air defense and strike umbrella hundreds of miles from its coastline into the heart of what UNCLOS designates as international waters. The Philippines has been the most active claimant state in pushing back against Chinese activities. In 2023 and 2024, Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels conducted a series of confrontations with Philippine resupply vessels attempting to reach the BRP Sierra Madre at Second Thomas Shoal, firing water cannons, deploying lasers, and impeding navigation. These incidents represent the most sustained physical testing of freedom of navigation principles in the South China Sea since China's island-building program reached its current scale. The Indo-Pacific is not a two-power story. It is a region of approximately 40 states, each with its own strategic interests, economic dependencies, and political calculations. Japan is the United States' most important ally in the Indo-Pacific and the region's third-largest economy. Its 2022 National Security Strategy, the most significant shift in Japanese defense policy since the post-war constitution was written, committed Japan to doubling its defense budget, acquiring 500 Tomahawk cruise missiles for counterstrike capability, and developing joint combat operations with U.S. forces at unprecedented depth. Australia occupies the southern anchor of the U.S. alliance architecture. It has signed AUKUS, committing to acquire nuclear-powered attack submarines at a cost of approximately 368 billion Australian dollars over 30 years. Its 2026 National Defence Strategy committed to between 425 billion and 560 billion Australian dollars in capabilities over the coming decade. India is the region's most complex strategic actor. It is a member of the Quad, the strategic grouping with the United States, Japan, and Australia, but simultaneously a founding member of the non-aligned movement. India maintains defense and energy relationships with Russia. It has unresolved border disputes with China, including an ongoing military standoff in the Ladakh region following the 2020 Galwan Valley clash. India is not formally part of the Western alliance system, but its strategic interests in freedom of navigation in the Indian Ocean, in a region not dominated by China, and in its own economic development, increasingly align with those of the Quad partners. Indonesia is the world's fourth most populous country, the largest economy in Southeast Asia, and the geographic custodian of two of the region's most important alternative straits, Lombok and Sunda. Indonesia's foreign policy doctrine of bebas aktif, free and active, commits it to engagement with all sides while formal alignment with none. But Indonesia's own South China Sea interests are real. Chinese fishing and Coast Guard vessels have repeatedly entered Indonesia's claimed exclusive economic zone near the Natuna Islands. Singapore, located at the southern end of the Strait of Malacca, is simultaneously the region's most important financial center, its most significant logistics hub, and host to a significant U.S. naval and logistics presence. Vietnam has the longest and most contentious history of South China Sea disputes with China and has been among the most consistent opponents of China's claims, conducting its own drilling operations in disputed areas. Now here is the alliance architecture in detail, because the distinctions between the different arrangements matter strategically. Five Eyes is an intelligence sharing alliance, not a mutual defense treaty. AUKUS is a technology and capability program centered on nuclear-powered submarines and advanced technology, not a collective defense commitment. The Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, is a diplomatic and strategic forum without a defense treaty commitment. ANZUS, the Australia-New Zealand United States Security Treaty of 1951, is a collective defense commitment, but New Zealand's participation was suspended in 1986 following its nuclear-free policy. The U.S.-Japan, U.S.-Philippines, and U.S.-South Korea bilateral treaties are the most operationally binding, providing genuine collective defense commitments with station forces. NATO's Indo-Pacific engagement, through individual tailored partnership programs with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, represents Atlantic Alliance interest in Indo-Pacific security, but does not extend NATO's Article 5 collective defense commitment to the region. The practical significance of these distinctions is this: the Indo-Pacific Alliance network is less tightly integrated than NATO. It is more like a web of bilateral relationships and overlapping functional partnerships than a unified alliance with a single command structure. Whether that web is sufficient to deter, and if necessary respond to, major conflict scenarios is one of the central questions of Indo-Pacific strategic analysis. The economic competition in the Indo-Pacific has three dimensions. The first is trade and supply chains. The region is simultaneously the world's largest trading bloc and the location of most of the world's semiconductor, electronics, and consumer goods manufacturing. The second dimension is critical minerals and rare earths. The Indo-Pacific, particularly Australia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Papua New Guinea, contains extraordinary concentrations of the minerals required for clean energy transition and advanced technology. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, rare earth elements, the inputs to electric vehicle batteries, wind turbines, semiconductors, and military guidance systems. China currently processes approximately 60% of the world's lithium, more than 80% of rare earth elements, and dominates cobalt refining. That processing dominance gives China leverage over supply chains that Western governments are now investing billions of dollars to reduce. The third dimension is digital infrastructure. The Indo-Pacific contains approximately 500,000 kilometers of undersea cables carrying virtually all intercontinental internet traffic. The security of those cables, their routing, their landing stations, and the companies that own and operate them, has become a major intelligence and strategic concern. The headline story of the military balance is the shift in the naval balance. The United States Navy, which has maintained uncontested maritime superiority in the Pacific since 1945, is facing a China that is building ships faster than any other country in modern history. China's 2026 Naval Order of Battle includes the Type 003 Fujian carrier, multiple Type 055 large destroyers, and a submarine fleet expanding towards 70 to 80 boats. In the missile domain, China has developed a significant advantage in intermediate-range ballistic missiles. The DF-21D and DF-26, sometimes called carrier-killer missiles, that can threaten U.S. aircraft carriers at ranges of approximately 1,500 and 4,000 kilometers, respectively. In the domain of nuclear weapons, China is expanding its arsenal. The U.S. Department of Defense's 2023 China Military Power Report assessed that China had over 500 operational nuclear warheads as of 2023 and could have over 1,000 by 2030, a significant increase from the few hundred estimated a decade earlier. The honest assessment of the military balance from IISS, RAND, and the U.S. Congressional Research Service is this. The United States retains overall military superiority in the Indo-Pacific, but China's military modernization has significantly eroded the margin of that superiority, particularly in the near seas around Taiwan and in the first island chain. The question is no longer whether the U.S. can win a conflict in the Indo-Pacific. The question is whether the cost and risk of winning are acceptable, and whether that uncertainty itself undermines deterrence. Here is how 4 analytical traditions interpret the Indo-Pacific and its significance. The U.S. strategic view is that the Indo-Pacific is the defining theater of 21st century great power competition. China's rise under an authoritarian government that rejects the fundamental norms of the international order, uses economic coercion against smaller states, and is building military forces explicitly designed to challenge American power, requires sustained investment in alliances, military presence, and economic partnerships. The alliance network, freedom of navigation operations, and capability programs like AUKUS are, on this view, not aggressive acts. They are the minimum necessary to preserve the rules-based order that has underpinned Indo-Pacific prosperity since 1945. The Chinese strategic view is that the U.S. alliance network and the framing of the region as a theater of competition is itself the destabilizing force. China describes its maritime activities as the legitimate assertion of historical rights and the protection of its sovereign interests. The Belt and Road is development cooperation, not strategic encirclement, and the framing of the region as an arena of U.S.-China competition is, on Beijing's view, a self-fulfilling prophecy that serves American strategic interests by rallying allies against a manufactured threat. The ASEAN perspective is perhaps the most analytically distinctive. ASEAN's 10 member states do not want to choose sides between China and the United States. Their economies depend on trade with both. Their security depends on American military presence. Their neighborhood stability depends on not provoking China. ASEAN centrality, the principle that ASEAN-led processes should be at the center of regional security architecture, is under greater strain than at any point since the Cold War. The realist geopolitical perspective frames the Indo-Pacific primarily as a case study in the dynamics of rising and established power. When a rising power approaches parity with an established one, the probability of conflict increases, not because either side wants it, but because miscalculation becomes more likely. commitments become harder to walk back, and the window for deterrence narrows. The realist prescription is managed competition, sustaining enough communication, mutual deterrence, and economic interdependence to reduce the probability of miscalculation. Before the conclusion, the skeptics challenge. What evidence would challenge this documentary's framing? First, the conflict pessimism argument. The same description of military buildup, contested choke points, and shifting balances was made of the Cold War, which lasted 45 years without direct military conflict between the major powers. Nuclear deterrence, economic interdependence, and the cost calculus of conflict have historically been more powerful constraints than the pessimists of any era predicted. China and the United States are deeply economically interdependent. The cost of conflict, in economic disruption, in semiconductor supply chain collapse, in energy market shock, would be borne by both sides. That interdependence is the most underrated constraint in Western strategic analysis. Second, the China overextension argument. China's assertiveness has produced significant strategic costs. The Philippines has moved decisively toward the United States. Japan has fundamentally reversed its post-war defense posture. Australia committed to AUKUS. India has deepened its Quad engagement. Vietnam has quietly strengthened its defense relationships. China's assertiveness has produced the coalition that American strategists sought but could not have assembled as quickly without Beijing's help. Third, the economic decoupling limits. Full decoupling from an $18.5 trillion economy that is the primary trading partner of most Indo-Pacific states is an objective that has never been demonstrated at scale. China's processing dominance in critical minerals reflects decades of investment that Western alternatives will take a decade or more to match. Here is what can be stated with confidence and what cannot. What we know. The Indo-Pacific is home to approximately 65% of world population and generates approximately 60% of global GDP, confirmed. Approximately $3.4 trillion in trade transits the South China Sea annually, CSIS confirmed. The Strait of Malacca carries approximately 22% of global maritime trade, IMO and UNCTAD confirmed. China imports approximately 80% of its oil through the Strait of Malacca, confirmed. TSMC produces approximately 90% of the world's most advanced chips, confirmed. China's naval fleet targets 435 ships by 2030 and 70 submarines by 2027, confirmed. The PCA 2016 ruling, China's 9-dash line has no legal basis under UNCLOS, confirmed. China rejected the ruling, confirmed. Japan committed to doubling its defense budget to 2% of GDP by 2027, confirmed. AUKUS committed Australia to nuclear-powered submarines at approximately 368 billion Australian dollars over 30 years, confirmed. What we do not know. Whether Taiwan will remain outside Chinese control, the most consequential unknown in the entire region. Whether China's naval buildup will produce quality to match its quantity. Whether AUKUS submarines will deliver on their projected timeline. Whether ASEAN centrality can survive the increasing polarization of the strategic environment. Whether India will move more decisively into alignment with the Quad partners or maintain its strategic autonomy. Whether economic decoupling in semiconductors and critical minerals will succeed at the pace Western governments project. Whether the military balance in China's near seas already makes deterrence unreliable, or whether it remains intact. The most defensible evidence-based interpretation of the Indo-Pacific in 2026 is this. The region is not becoming strategically important. It already is. Its importance is not a future projection or an analytical prediction. It is a present reality, documented in shipping volumes, GDP figures, military deployments, and the decisions of every major government that has reclassified this region as its primary strategic priority. The forces shaping it, China's rise, the contest over maritime choke points, the semiconductor geography that places irreplaceable factories on a disputed island, The alliance network that tries to preserve a rules-based order against a power that rejects the order's adjudication are structural. They will not be resolved by a single election, a single summit, or a single crisis. They will be managed or they will not. Over decades of decisions made by governments whose names we do not yet know, in crises we cannot yet predict, about technologies that do not yet exist. Geography has not changed. Its importance has. The Indo-Pacific is not the future of global power. It is the present. The question is not whether the world will be shaped there. The question is how, and how wisely. I am the Anglosphere Report, the stories your local media won't connect. Tell me in the comments. Do you think the Indo-Pacific rivalry can be managed below the threshold of armed conflict for the next decade? Or are the structural forces, the military buildups, the contested choke points, the semiconductor geography, moving faster than the diplomacy? See you next time.